and welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Like, comment, and subscribe. Now, you already know what our report is going to be about today, so let's get right into it. Now, I'm not just going to do a report on the Russo-Ukrainian war and Russia's attack on Ukraine. I'm going to do a full-on analysis. And full disclosure, maybe I'm going to be completely right, and I'll get to say I told you so in a month or two. Or maybe I'm completely wrong and I'm going to be extremely embarrassed to the point where I delete this video. Now let's do my analysis, which is that Ukraine is going to win this war. Now hear me out. Okay, Russia's initial attack on Ukraine has been devastating. Russia has executed massive airstrikes, taking out Ukraine's air defenses, while also carrying out extensive cyber attacks, making it difficult for the military forces of Ukraine to communicate with one another. And fundamentally, it has captured massive strategical areas like the former radioactive plant of Chernobyl, and also stationing massive amounts of troops right outside of Kyiv, basically preparing the entire city for a siege, the capital city of Ukraine. Now, despite all of this, I still believe that Ukraine is going to win this war. Why? Many of you are going to think that that assumption is crazy. And when you look at the mainstream media, this conflict is being portrayed as David versus Goliath, except David doesn't win. Goliath kicks his goddamn ass. Now, Russia has moved in and it has devastated Ukraine, and the media is portraying Ukraine as this small, tiny little country that can barely hold out unless it gets Western support. Now, keep in mind that there is an ulterior motive for the way that this conflict is being presented to Western viewers. A lot of this is being done to increase public support for Ukraine, just in case that the West, the United States, and its NATO allies decide to become militarily involved. Now, that is still highly unlikely. In regards to a Western reaction, what has been done has been the implication of massive sanctions. Sanctions that have already hurt Russia's economy, specifically Russia's wealthiest class. Now, that's important to know because these oligarchs and these elites are the people who run the country. Yes, the fundamental belief is that Vladimir Putin is this great, big, strong dictator with mega big muscles and strong military, who everyone listens to. But the reality is that not a single country on this earth can be run or fully dictated by one individual. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Joe Biden, the guy from North Korea, what's his name? Kim Jong-un, Olaf Scholz, Boris Johnson. There is not a single country, Abiy Ahmed, Ethiopia, not a single country in this earth where all of the decisions and all of the power rest in one person. Vladimir Putin, just like every other world leader, is dependent on his inner circle, and that inner circle is dependent on finances, and those finances come from Russia's oligarchs. Now, Western sanctions have already shown to be effective, and more will come. But so far, Russia's invasion itself, while relatively maintaining some form of strategic advances, has not been as successful as predicted. Now, I want to make things very clear. A lot of what I'm going to say during this episode, and I'm going to completely admit it, and I don't want to mislead anyone, is pure conjecture. Now, this is not just random guessing. A lot of these are educated guesses established on fundamental facts that I'm going to use and process to come to other relative conclusions that are probably true. Now, that doesn't mean that it's 100% absolute. This information is not confirmed, and again, it's analysis and conjecture. Keep that in mind. Now, Russia has made some strategic advances, but it's nowhere near as much as the massive federation planned. In addition to this, when looking at the casualty reports of the conflict, it seems that Russia has been losing a lot more soldiers than the Ukrainian side. Altogether, Ukraine has reported that it has lost 137,000 people flat. That is including civilians and military personnel. The vast majority of these casualties, however, have been military. Russia clearly is not targeting civilians. To its credit, that needs to be stated. And 10 of these 137 casualties that have been reported by Ukraine have been officers in the Ukrainian military, which clearly does hurt them. Now, that being said, Russia is estimated to have had over 450 to 500 military casualties, significantly more than the Ukrainian side. Now, a lot of you are going to say, oh, Dennis, these are the Ukrainian and Western numbers. Obviously, they're going to be biased against Russia. That is true. But keep in mind that Russia has not reported any official number, not even stating that they haven't lost anyone yet. And that is strange. Even if the Russian military wanted to manipulate numbers and make it seem like they were winning the war, they would release fake numbers. And they haven't released any numbers, period. Now, the second biggest tell that Russia is losing this conflict is that it has begun to recruit militias that are not part of the Russian Federation military, specifically those coming from Chechnya. Now, it should be noted that Chechnya is another region within Russia that has historically had massive conflicts with the Russian Federation. Now, Chechnya is primarily Muslim, and they feel that ethnically they are different people. This has historically led to massive conflicts. Now, these conflicts have more or less been resolved, and Chechnya now coexists peacefully as part of the Russian Federation. But Russia is inviting Chechen militias to fight alongside its soldiers. Now, I should state that maybe the reason that this is being done is just to, along the way of taking care of the more major and pressing concern of demilitarizing and removing the head of government of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is making an attempt to kind of build a camaraderie with the Chechen militia forces and the Chechen government. Now, that may or may not be true, but it does seem that the Russian Federation forces that have already been amassed alongside the border in preparation for this invasion have not been enough. And they had a lot of soldiers, 150,000 soldiers have partaken in this invasion and were amassed alongside the border before the attacks occurred. Now, what else needs to be considered is that the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who is number one on Russia's hit list, has not left the country. Now, he has had many different virtual meetings with Western and European leaders, and all these leaders have reported that it can be seen that he is reporting from some kind of bunker. He has not left Kiev. He has not left Ukraine. And it should be noted that many of you are going to say, oh, well, he's not in danger. He's the president of a sovereign state. Look at the history of Russian invasions. Specifically, look at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and what the Soviet army did to Afghan president of the PDPA Khalq faction, Hafizullah Amin. When they moved into Afghanistan before their occupation and invasion, they went into one of the presidential palaces that were at the time occupied by Amin and killed him, every single male member of his family, and imprisoned all of the women in Amin's family in the brutal Pul-e-Charki prison in Afghanistan, where they were tortured and raped for about 10 to 15 years. Russia, historically, is not kind to the people it removes from power. Now, I do want to just add one disclosure here. Hafizullah Amin, the communist dictator of Afghanistan that was running the Khalq PDPA faction that was killed and removed by the Soviets, was kind of a dick and deserved that. But let's get back to Ukraine. Obviously, Zelensky has a lot of reasons to leave Ukraine and create a government in exile and direct his military forces from outside of the country. He and his family and his ministers and his government leadership would be much safer outside of the country, but they have not left. They are staying, and this shows that they are extremely confident. Now, I want to add that Zelensky clearly is a man that loves his country, But he's also, based on other corruption scandals and some very convincing evidence that he's actually partaken in them, is a man that is self-serving. Now, every politician is like this, and I'm not going to levy some heavy criticism against him right now while his country is being occupied and invaded by one of the world's largest military powers. But Zelensky is not going to stay somewhere where he's definitely going to die. So it does show that the Ukrainian government has a high level of confidence in what's going on. Now, the biggest indicator that Russia is losing is that Russia itself today has made calls for peace talks. Now, here's the thing. You don't invade a much smaller country that you are apparently very confident in your ability of defeating in a war, and one day later ask for peace talks. The reality is even if you're winning the war and you do want to have peace talks and resolve the situation amicably, you keep pushing militarily while you're winning because this gives you more leverage. And when you have more leverage, you can get more consolidations from the other side. Now, if Russia was actually winning the war as it's stating, or that its invasion was going as productively as is to be believed by Russian information, then they would keep going. They would keep pushing. They would move right into Kiev, and they would completely take out the government of Ukraine and have peace talks with a Russian implant or a pro-Russian government leader that would be imposed by them. Now, again, this is all conjecture, but all of the events that have occurred in the last 48 hours seem to indicate that things, at the very least, are not going in the direction that was intended by the Russian Federation and its president, Vladimir Putin, before carrying out this invasion. Now, I want to make one final note that makes the fact that Ukraine is going to win this war undeniable. First, you have to understand and define what is victory, what is winning for both sides. Let's look at what Russia needs to do to fundamentally win this war in Ukraine. First and foremost, Russia needs to completely demilitarize all of the official military forces of Ukraine. This is not counting the countless members that have joined militias and have, from a civilian perspective, prepared to fight a guerrilla warfare against Russia. In addition to this, it has to move into every single major city in Ukraine, liquidate its military defenses, and establish some kind of rule and military control over these cities. Finally, Russia has to remove the government of Ukraine, including the president and his other ministers. Now, lastly, this government has to be replaced by a pro-Russian leader and a pro-Russian government. And most importantly, and most difficultly, this government needs to be assisted in consolidating control over Ukraine. Keep in mind that even if Russia gets to the point of removing the government of Ukraine, of toppling every single major city in Ukraine, and of getting rid of the nation's military defenses, and finally putting in a pro-Russian implant to lead the nation, the reality is that Russia and this pro-Russian government are going to be faced with a major insurgency, which is going to be more organized, probably better funded, better trained, and more motivated than what the Soviet Union faced against the Mujahideen in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. Now, the reality is nation building is extremely difficult. It's not just peace building. You have to win the hearts and minds of all the citizens, which they never are going to like you if you invade their country, period. Look at what the United States did in Afghanistan. Built schools, built infrastructure, significantly improved the economy of the country. But hey, Afghans still fucking hated the United States. Why? Because when you invade someone's country, you're not going to be popular, even if you're doing it to be a nice guy and help them out. It's just fundamentally nonsensical. And the Ukrainians are very proud people that are willing to fight, kill, and die for their country, and they will do so on a goddamn cross if they have to. So the reality is for Russia to win this conflict, it has to go all 9 yards and even further. Now, what does Ukraine have to do to win this conflict? The reality is the only thing that Ukraine has to do is hold out. And it doesn't even have to hold out that long. As I mentioned before, Western sanctions, and these were just the first rounds of the sanctions that have been introduced, have already had major negative effects on Russia's economy. Now, other forms of sanctions have been debated, and they will be introduced. Some of the most extreme could completely remove Russia from the international financial system by banning it from the SWIFT banking procedure. I don't have time to get into all the details, but I will if the sanctions are introduced. Nonetheless, the economic sanctions are causing an impact on the Russian people and the Russian government, particularly Vladimir Putin, which is going to provide pressure to get the fuck out of the country and stop harming Russia economically. Now, the only thing Ukraine needs to do is hold out. How long? How long? Look, I cannot predict this, but you know what? I'm making so many assumptions during this video, I might as well. Ukraine only needs to hold out for less than 3 months. If the government of Ukraine, or if the government is removed, any potential insurgency movement simply needs to hold out and withstand Russian occupation for 3 months before the economic factors on Russia's economy and the fact that it is essentially becoming a pariah state. No nation has supported this invasion except China, who didn't really support Russia's intervention and just kind of made a comparison to why is it okay for the United States to enter so many countries in the Middle East, but it's wrong for Russia to enter Ukraine, which is kind of an accurate argument, but it's relevant. Russia does not truly have a lot of relevant international support besides its CSTO ally countries who are essentially irrelevant on the international field. So the only thing Ukraine has to do is hold out for 3 months while Russia keeps living in its pariah state and has economic consequences that are major. Now, obviously analyzing this, one comes to the conclusion, why did Russia invade in the first place? It would have been much more productive for Russia to just play the long game and continue what it's been doing for the last, not 8 years, not just Russia's annexation of Crimea and its support of pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass region, but what Russia has been doing specifically for the last, let's say 6 to 10 years, no one really knows exactly how much, by using online methods and propaganda methods to keep building dissent and eventually see Western governments and Ukraine's government fall apart. And through subversion and undermining take control. Russia could have done this. It would have taken much longer, but it would not have had to invade. So if it's so difficult for Russia to actually win this invasion, why did a man that is as effective at leading and cold calculating and typically very, very good at making decisions that are related to international relations and the acts of carrying out Russia's foreign policy interests, Vladimir Putin, why would this president, time-tested and efficient President Vladimir Putin, commit to such a dumbass idea? The reality is that Vladimir Putin, his goal was not to invade and essentially remove the government of Ukraine. Maybe it was to remove Zelensky. Now, Vladimir Putin's stated goal was to demilitarize Ukraine and remove its military from the equation. And let's actually take him for his word there, because he's probably right. The goal of Russia seems to have been removing Ukraine's military by destroying its military resources, by killing enough soldiers, and then forcing Ukraine to come to the table and have peace negotiations where Ukraine would essentially make all the concessions and all the consolidations that Russia would want, giving Russia everything it needed in peace talks. But I don't think that Russia anticipated for the Ukrainian military to fight as bravely and fight as efficiently as it has. And I definitely don't believe that Russia anticipated so many Ukrainians themselves to join militias and prepare to fight a guerrilla warfare against Russia. Now, it should be noted that depending on how this situation develops, it's going to have political consequences for a lot of actors, which I will cover in another episode. But the reality is let's just comment on Vladimir Putin. If Russia does not win or does not come out in some public way or perceived as victorious from this invasion, and if Ukraine is able to hold out while Russia's economy faces the consequences of sanctions, and Russia loses any form of international stance that it has and becomes a pariah, Vladimir Putin is fucked. This will be the end of his legacy and probably the end of his career, which at the end of the day probably isn't a bad thing. Keep in mind that Vladimir Putin is 69 years old. Now, 69 is not that old, especially when you compare him with everyone's favorite dinosaur-in-chief, Joe Biden, but 69 by Russian standards is pretty ancient. And the man clearly, in his videos, seems like he just wants to relax and probably retire. But again, that's more speculation, and that's what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let's have a nice debate on who you think is winning the war in Ukraine, how you think it's going to develop, and what the future of the Russo-Ukrainian war is. Do you think it's going to be over soon, or do you think this is going to be a prolonged nightmare that's going to take somewhere as long as the Afghanistan occupation? Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.